Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for today's episode of the Bibliosophia channel. I have a special guest. Perhaps some of you have heard of her. Perhaps some of you have read her books. But today I am joined by the incomparable Shani Oates. Shani, thank you so much for joining me today.
Lovely to be here, Samuel. Thank you.
So you are fresh off the heels of the recent release of The Search for Ódinn, the latest tome in your trilogy with Anathema, and I'm fairly certain that your readers are more than excited to get their hands on a copy. I know the photos of the artisanal edition are quite tantalizing with the leather selection, the cover art, and all of the marketing photos. Every time I look at them, I can't help but think, I wonder how well that book smells, because there's nothing like a leather-bound book to whet the appetite of the reader.
It is true. And, you know, Anathema have done the most amazing job. It's absolutely gorgeous. In fact, all three editions are.
Yes.
Always are. But the artisanal one, I am, getting very excited. It's on its way to me, apparently. So I can't wait to see it.
Certainly a lot under your belt. And I have to ask, how often do you sleep? And do you sleep at all?
I don't sleep a great deal. No, I am a serial insomniac. Probably 4 hours a night if I'm lucky. Some nights I don't sleep at all. But I guess that's the way when, you know, you're inspired, you just get up and work, and there's always so much to do. If it's not researching, it's writing. If it's not writing, it's editing what you've written. So yes, keeps me very busy. There is not really a separation between the research and the work and the spiritual path, because they enfold each other. And you tend to find that when you get up and you start your day, whatever you're doing is fulfilling that enterprise. So it's all par for the course.
So in addition to your writing and your research, your praxis is one that has taken you seemingly from one end of the spectrum to another. And I'm wondering if you would indulge me, as well as our listeners and our viewers, and give us a little insight into what makes your spiritual praxis, and perhaps even a Cliff Notes version of your journey and your spirituality, your spiritual praxis from past to present.
Oh my, that is quite a long journey. I guess it really began when I was a child, and it had various experiences, like often people do, but they were soon taken up and guided by other people. So a lot of people came into my life that were able to take up that experience and move it forward. And some of those are my grandparents on both sides, maternal and paternal. And some of those were figures that came like ships in the night and were just mentors for a brief time.
Mm-hmm.
But always left an impact and seemed to steer me correctly towards an inevitable end. Now, they gave me lots of experiences in what could be construed as folk magic, background of history, craft, all sorts of meaningful things that seemed to resonate with me in a deep sense that made me long for something more. And it wasn't until many years later that I found out what I was actually seeking was not so much more knowledge as much as people to share it with, a camaraderie, company, plan almost, if you like. And I felt that was missing in society. I soon realized that our society now is so dysfunctional, so deconstructed, that we don't tend to have much of a community. There isn't much instance now where you can go and meet people of your own kind and gather together as a proper unit. It's something a bit hit and miss. And I met quite a lot of people from the occult world in various stripes, from one end of the spectrum to the other. And that was very interesting, to be able to meet people with different goals, different ideals, different praxis. And it encouraged me to pursue my own, even though theirs were all very, very interesting. I wanted something more in keeping with my roots in this country, specifically because I feel that that's important to have an ancestral tradition.
Mhm.
So I tried to pursue and find others that followed that same ilk. And that led me to write to a lot of people. I got a lot of responses. And one of those was Evan John Jones, who had been the Magister of the Clan of Tubal Cain for the past 30 odd years at that time. He'd succeeded Robert Cochrane as Magister of the clan after Robert Cochrane died in 66. And he had some amazing information and he shared a lot with me. And one of the most interesting things at that time, while we were in correspondence, was the discussion that came up about Gardnera. And he advised me to actually pursue Wicca, which surprised me because I thought, wow, it's something that's so diametrically opposed to what you're doing. Would you do that? And he said, well, Robert was very much opposed to Wicca, Robert Cochrane. Lots of other people are, but he said, I never had a problem with it. And he was very close with Doreen Valiente at that time. They'd worked for a long time together. And of course, Doreen had feet in many camps, Wicca and traditional craft. So he said, go and speak to Doreen. He introduced me to Doreen, which was a marvel. And I treasure those times we had together. She was a wonderful lady. And she also had some fantastic discussions to share with me about Robert Cochrane and about Gerald Gardner. And I thought, okay, so I'll dip my toe and see if I can find out what is this about. Then at least I've got a fair assumption to discuss it from, and another interest and another perspective on the craft. So that is what I did. But it didn't take me away from the heart of traditional craft, which is where my real interest lay. So I dipped my toe in that, but I kept my interest in traditional craft. And the rest is history. Here I am, now the matriarch of the Clan of Tubal Cain, with a great deal of, shall we say, coyness, I suppose, about that position. But it's one that I try to hold with the deepest sincerity because it does mean a lot to me. And it has been a revelation and instrumental in forging my path over the past 30 years of who I am now.
It's quite fascinating. And you mentioned Robert Cochrane, who many people are familiar with, but there perhaps is a number, or a small number, if you will, of individuals who are not familiar. He seems to have made a name for himself much in the same way, if not similar, to that of Gerald Gardner. I was wondering if perhaps you could talk on him briefly.
Yeah, I think he's very much surrounded by lots of controversy. He was driven so deeply by his belief in his path, a deep-seated desire to bring people into a different perspective of the occult world than the one that was being offered by Gerald Gardner. And he frequently came to loggerheads with a lot of people, Wiccans specifically, because he was frustrated that people were not taking as much attention towards his work and his path as they were with Gerald Gardner, which was far more popular because it had a greater appeal. It was more universal. It was pagan. And Robert Cochrane was opposed to paganism as much as he was opposed to Wicca. He was very much pushing what he believed to be an older type of craft, more traditionally based. And by that I mean, because that in itself is a loaded word and has so many different connotations and explanations, and people have different interpretations of traditional craft. But for Robert Cochrane and the Clan of Tubal Cain, we hold it to be very much based in folk magic, and one that is based in culture, and one that is based very much around the traditions that were around in the 18th and 19th centuries, but which had inherited older beliefs cumulatively. So it's deep-seated as a culture-based thing, but it's also one that he believed, in his own words, he described it as the last mystery tradition. in that it promotes mysticism, a deeper spirituality than what he believed Wicca was offering, which on the surface, because a lot of people do take it very deeply and meaningfully, but on the surface it is something that has no cosmology and no end times. So it doesn't have an eschatology. So it just exists in its own creation, its own bubble. Whereas the Clan of Tubal Cain and Robert Cochrane's development of that very much has a cosmology and an eschatology. So it's a full-rounded thing. And that is what he was trying to get to people. But because of the extreme discipline in it and the arduous path to actually secure and learn the mythos, it was never very popular. And of course, he himself was such a volatile person. He held very much a belief that there was a social policy that you could not take away from your spirituality. Your history, your politics and everything was all one. Whereas Gardner had separated all of that, made it very clean, that it wasn't political. There was not really any history other than a romantic notion of paganism from the 18th century that he revived into Wicca. But Robert Cochrane was having none of that. So he was a deeply frustrated but massively, deeply driven person who wanted to bring culture back to people and spirituality. And his frustrations, as they often led him to loggerheads with people. But he was the most innovative poet, the most fascinating mind. I mean, reading through some of his words and his works, his philosophies are second to none. They haven't yet been rivaled, to my knowledge, and in my opinion. Others may think differently.
Were there any instances wherein this practice or this tradition could perhaps be more compatible with, say, folk Christian traditions that were common in the countryside?
Very much so. In fact, he said we have more in common with Christianity than with paganism. That was his strong belief, simply for that reason, because we had in this country, all our folk magic and folk craft has developed cumulatively through Christianity over 1,500 years of it. And that's not something you can just wipe away and say, okay, I'm going to want a new religion, which is what Gerald Gardner and Aleister Crowley did. Essentially, they created something and mass marketed it for a specific purpose, because it wanted to set up an alternative to Christianity. Whereas Robert Cochrane was saying, no, we don't want an alternative to Christianity. We want our view of Christianity, which we have developed in distinction to general Christianity. Folk magic is based in Christianity, but it has its own little mores and lovely little nuances. And that is what he wanted people to be more interested in. And of course, the natural culture of this country and this land, which he deeply loved.
I can definitely see why he would be considered a catalyzing, controversial individual. And there's nothing wrong with controversy. I think controversy is healthy, especially when you have a spiritual tradition that doesn't adhere to some conception of the norm, especially when the culture in which one is rooted, it's a tapestry that they are part and parcel of. They cannot divest themselves from that culture. It's quite a fascinating subject and definitely one to chew on. I'm curious, given the knowledge and the insight that you have into the Cochrane tradition, you had mentioned ancestry. However, we have the name Tubal Cain, which is indicative of an individual who, at least according to Old Testament scripture, originated in the Near East, in the Levant. I'm wondering how that plays into this ancestral current. Was he an archetypal figure that Cochrane looked to?
That's an excellent question. Because again, a lot of people are very curious as to why the word and name Tubal Cain should be involved in a tradition that claims cultural folk magic of these lands. And of course, as I mentioned, there is the elements of Christianity and Gnosticism, folk traditions and folk magic. There's also elements of heathenism, Anglo-Saxon and Norse, traditions that have fed into those folk magics that have developed over time. So people often say, well, why not Volund? Why not Wayland? What has Tubal Cain? What's the purpose of that? And I think regarding ancestry, as far as ancestry goes, what Robert Cochrane did there by referring to Tubal Cain and adopting him as a tutelary spirit leader, he was acknowledging, first of all, his direct and personal ancestry through his grandfather, because he was a horse whisperer and a horseman. So he was linking that tradition there directly to him, and with an acknowledgement saying, yep, my grandfather did this, and I know that within the Horseman's Word they acknowledge various characters, including Tubal Cain, because a lot of the guilds that were in the 18th century and 19th century were remnants of the guilds that formed in the medieval periods, that were also based on Freemasons, who also used Tubal Cain. So you've got all these guilds developing in similar formats to the Freemasonry, but they were rural trades mostly. Some were urban crafts, with shoemakers, leather makers, and such forth, potters and pans and sailors, sailmakers. And then you've got the more rural ones with ploughmen and toadmen, and anything to do with horses needed horse whisperers. Even the armies and needed horse whisperers and horsemen. So therefore he was acknowledging his grandfather, whom he claimed was a horse whisperer. So he was saying, yeah, we acknowledge Tubal Cain. But also with that, he incredibly, very amazingly linked it back to the first smith, because the Tubal Cain is the first smith of all. So he's saying, yep, we've got a deep interest in the 18th century rural traditions, the horseman, but we also, by using this name, can take it right back to the first smith. And the first smith was not just a smith. Tubal Cain at that point was a creator, a molder of people, a purveyor of spirituality, a creator of civilization, music, everything that is what you would like to evolve and develop the human condition, everything you would need to evolve a person into being everything that we could be. So you've got the creation, the development, the evolution, the progress, the expansion, the movement, even to the point of being a nomad, moving on, expressing your craft is something that the Gnostics were great teachers in. They were mobile, they were not sedentary, they didn't set down roots. So he's saying, yep, we've got a nomadic tradition, it's a teaching tradition, it's an inheritor of all those creativities and spiritualities, and we want to take them out into the world and share them. But we do so as a mystery tradition with its own guarded guilds and crafts and statesmanship, and it's protected by those guilds and the word. The word is so important, because that's the secret, and that's how we look after what is truly secret, but you share what is precious. So Tubal Cain encompasses all of that and offers all of that. So that's why I chose Tubal Cain.
Thank you for that brief masterclass on the subject. I find that fascinating. I find it interesting when cultures and traditions look to what could be described as a Promethean figure to represent their people, represent their tradition, represent their craft. I find that is, it speaks to our human condition to look to someone or something, some distant progenitor who gives us meaning, who shares their name, who gives their name, in this case, to a tradition. You've certainly given a great deal of insight into this fascinating tradition of these guilds. I do want to turn back to your many contributions to our shared community, our subculture that is the occult, the esoteric, the other, if you will. And specifically with regards to your recent publication, of course, with the search for Ódinn and the complementary books that came before that, I'm wondering if you would indulge me and our viewers and our listeners into what that driving force was. What was your compulsion to start this daunting research and spend countless hours writing about this incredibly complex character in myth and history and religion?
Um, yes, I mean the Ódinn and Woden both are incredibly complex, and I suppose it's something I promised Evan John Jones, many, 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 many years ago, when he was highlighting all the instances of heathenism within our particular craft tradition. It is something that I found difficult initially to digest because it seemed so complex to me. At that point, I had touched upon runes and runology, and obviously I'd heard about Ódinn and Woden and such forth. But once he got into the mechanics of that, I thought, wow, this is just, where does it go? It's just such a fascinating cosmology. All this information about giants and ice giants, and the dwarves, and this entire world that Tolkien had opened up to me as a child. I thought, this is fascinating. It's not just a story in a book. It has history, it has reality, and it has an incredible spirituality and an incredible ethos. And of course, the ethos is what underlies our mythos very, very strongly. I thought, this is just something I've got to explore fully at a later time. And I promised him that I always would. And eventually I was able to dedicate my time properly to that research. So it has taken me quite a number of years, probably over a decade, really. Absolute devotion, nothing else dedicated to this exploration of finding out more about the origins of Woden and Ódinn and the entire cosmology and structure of their belief from way, way back, from the point of origin through to the Viking Age and era, and then beyond that as they became Christianized themselves. So, and how they served in Byzantium and all of that, the run-ins in the Europe. So I thought, wow, this is just so incredible because it underpins everything in our culture. It's who we are as a people. Our language structure is Nordic, it's Germanic. I thought, well, okay, so that's what I did. So that is what led to this entire series of work, because the more I read, the deeper down the rabbit hole I went, and the wider and the latitude. I thought, goodness me, if I don't read this in, I'll be writing forever. But there is nothing that it didn't touch, and every avenue that I went down just opened up more and more information and revealed more of the background. And much of it was in contradistinction to what was being popularly put out about heathenism. And that then drove me to, after a pause, I thought, okay, so I may have something to offer in my own opinions here, but I was certainly being led by the other, and I was completely absorbed by that other, and they drove me and guided me. And when I found the truth of those informations that I was being researched, I thought, this actually rings true. This is actually something that I think people should know about. It's information that's not generally available, and some of it really began to link up in certain ways that I thought reflected not just our tradition, but the tradition of the entire Northern peoples. And I thought that this was a very, very worthy topic to share with people, even though it's very different to what is generally put out. It's quite unorthodox in many respects, my views, but I've put all my research out there for people to check back and see where I've got my information from, because I come to very different conclusions to what many popular authors of heathenism have found themselves. But I've used the information from my own personal gnosis that I've been guided through, and through intellectualizing that information as well. So it's twofold, but it is very different to what is out there. I think you should never just take things that have been spoon-fed to you as literal truth. I think the truth is far beyond what any of us can comprehend. We each get a glimpse of it, a picture of it, and an insight into that. But we also, all of us, carry our personal bias. We have our own perspectives and we have our own agendas. And trying to get past those sometimes is very, very difficult. I try my best to be objective while remaining passionate about my subject. So it is not easy, but I try to achieve that without being ambiguous in places. The problem with a lot of academia is they're writing for a specific purpose. They are instructed in many respects to write it this way, write it that way. That was one of the things that frustrated me in academia, not being able to write from the heart. So while you can have the skills of academia, you have to also temper them with your own personal experience.
Absolutely. As I understand it, your trilogy was originally conceived as one great tome.
Yes.
Yeah. And certain conflicting issues arose which prevented such an endeavor to come to life. I'm curious, what was the guiding principle that directed you to parceling out this book into the three parts that you have? Was there a certain point in each one where you decided, okay, this is where the first one is going to end and this is where the second will begin? Was that an editorial process? Was that an intuitive process?
Oh, okay. The first two were fairly easy to make a cutoff point, because the first one and the second one were very they had very strict guidelines in their own titles, the Hanged God. So I specifically wanted to look at Ódinn as from the Havamal perspective, from all the traditions that have been written about why he was hanged. Was he related to a Christ figure? You know, was it a Christian perspective, or was it because he was a criminal, and all these things? So I thought, so I look at all of those traditions and ideas that surround him being a hanged god. And the second one, being Wolf's Head, was about his associations with outlaws and warriors and manabuns and lids and fizz. So it was all about fealty and troth and what led the camaraderie of his followers, and were they all warriors? What kind of warriors? So that was very much, again, a unit that I could separate. The third one, the actual search for him as an historical figure as well as a mythical figure, that was when the rabbit hole exploded. It was just vast, and the tome was just enormous. It was huge. The subject was just so vast. And as much as I tried to take things out, everything just seemed so relevant to my explanation of why I believe he is not what he has been presented to be, whereas I wanted something that had more truth in it, more guts. So the information was vast. So yeah, the book was enormous, and I've had to cut that down and it out, and it's still enormous, but it's left enough for other books, which we can talk about later if you like. But there are others to come, where a lot of the research was leading me into different areas that I have been able to slightly tease out into others. But this book's still big.
It certainly is. And for our viewers and listeners who are curious, including your bibliography, it's clocking in at 446 pages. So I'm curious to know, of those 446 pages that are bound, how many more pages were excised from the manuscript? Do you have those in a folder somewhere ready to be revised and re-revised and
I do.
revised to the third and fourth degree?
There's probably another 700 pages. Yeah, there is. Because they're going to be about the continuity of cult.
Mm.
That is something I find very important to culture and tradition. How certain things have continued despite the changes and shifts in faith, in the practices of faith, in belief, and in social geography. There is still a continuity. There's still a thread that can be seen through 2,000 years of history. That's not to say it was ever practiced in the same way. No one should ever claim that. You know, my tradition's 2,000 years old. No, it isn't. It can't be. But where you stand can be the result of a lot of changes and instances that led to it. And so that's one of the things I like to cover in another book, the continuity of cult. There's also, I think, a huge section on Woden being the leader of the Wild Hunt, all the traditions involved around that, and around him being a magician, a sorcerer, the creator of the Nine Herbs Charm, and many others. So there's that, and there's also the traditions of the northern peoples in the Silk Road trading, the Rus, and that brings all the European elements and the Slavic and the Far Eastern
Yes.
that I touched on in the search for Ódinn, but couldn't properly expand. I had to file it down to only those bits that were absolutely relevant to this book, but in the other one, I've been able to expand that much more. And then there's the female perspective, the women in the Northern tradition,
Mm-hmm.
from ancestral females, the Desir, the Valkyrie, and the goddesses, the female form, and ordinary women as well,
Mm-hmm.
how their lives affected their beliefs and how they worked towards creating the home and hearth, the actual foundation that the culture is based on, because without that, the warriors had no place. So it's not just about warrior and male tradition and all that. There's the strong female element, the hearth and home, that is everything. So there's a huge book going to be on women and spirituality of women.
So, with regards to the continuation of the cult, will this be, or will the scope of your work be inclusive of the ancient, if you will, to the modern day, or is it essentially going to be just exclusive to the European region of the world up to a certain point in time?
Um, it it does begin with the ancient, yes, it does, and it moves through all the patterns of belief and the movements of peoples, the migrations, the geography of migrating peoples from the Far East, and how that has affected belief and the interactions, because nothing exists in isolation. There is
Correct.
no nation that is pure, no culture that is pure. Everything has been intermingling for thousands of years. Everybody is made up of everyone else. So the only culture that we can say we can have is a culture of belief, because those are the things we formulate as a people. And the notion of a people is something that, again, Robert Cochrane was very much keen on promoting. Cultures develop around that then, but you need to be fairly established, and that doesn't happen overnight. That takes a very long time to
Right.
create. And even then, it's in constant flux and change, because again, you don't have stasis. Everything moves forward. So even faith and belief changes within a couple of 100 years. So each of those instances generates another idea, another change, and another shift. So this is, I suppose, the difference between our belief and Reconstructionism, for instance, because they're taking a slice of history, a slice of culture, a slice of belief, and centering their tradition that they're building up around that. Whereas because ours is a lived tradition, it recognizes all the changes, all the shifts, all the different beliefs, all the different contexts and perspectives. So in the continuity of cult, I'm trying to show how far back those beliefs are embedded and how much they've absorbed over time and changed and why and how. So it's very complicated, but it's been fascinating to research.
And you touched a bit on reconstruction, which I think is an important point to make, because to many people and to myself, you know, when I first heard your name several years ago and some of the work that you were doing, my impression based on the information presented to me was that you were a reconstructionist, and I find that that is not the case. You've made a complete distinction between yourself and that spiritual expression. I'm wondering if, hearkening back to our earlier subject when we were discussing Robert Cochrane and the Clan of Tubal Cain and that lived tradition, what would Cochrane's views have been on the the spiritual current that is alive today, in which one is seeking to reconstruct, if you will, or revive, as opposed to acknowledging these changes that occurred over time, the continuation of cult? Is that something that he focused upon or expounded upon, or was that something that he just completely disregarded because it wasn't relevant?
Well, he certainly balked against that, because he believed that that was people playing with ideas. From his perspective, his view was they're not being serious about their work. They are creating a fantasy and living an illusion. And he was all about truth. At the end of the day, truth was his great mistress. It was the overarching principle that he was, driven towards, and that is the mainstay of our tradition. That is everything that we're focused on: the truth of the matter, however painful, however arduous it is to get to it. It's understanding through gnosis the purpose and presence of truth, and that is to expose a lie, to expose illusion, it's to refute delusion. So therefore, he would hold reconstructionists in extreme disdain.
Well, I can certainly again see why he would be a controversial figure. With regards to the scope of the work that you've done, with regards to these 3 volumes, and with your third installation, do you find that your work is something that is beneficial to the Reconstruction community?
I hope that the research that I've done, because it has such a sound base in academia as well as personal gnosis, I hope that the Reconstructionists can take a lot of it on board and readapt, hopefully, some of their perspectives on how those people lived and what they really believed. Because much of what is popular today is actually only based in beliefs that have been around for 100, 150 years.
Mm-hmm.
They have no historical basis and no reality in truth. And yet they are as concrete in belief now as if they were forever. So I'm hoping to shake that up a little bit and give them food for thought, if nothing else. But so I'm sure I get lots of people coming to me now saying, blah, blah, this. And I hope I can give them the research to show where I've got my ideas from. I do try to list it all where it is, but if it's not in detail enough, I can happily provide that.
Well, as I said, a little controversy never hurts.
No, I'm certainly living on the end of Robert Cochrane's coattails there. Yeah.
Yes, you are definitely riding on his coattails. That is something to be proud of, and I applaud you for that.
Thank you.
Now, I do want to touch on the various written contributions that you've made, and you've recently, of course, during the course of this interview, mentioned some of the work that you've done and will continue to do?
I've personally been driven by the divine feminine all my life. She, her, the overarching wonder of the creatrix has been something that I find absolute wonderment in, from a Gnostic perspective, especially. So eventually, when I finish with this series on the Northern Otherworld and all the spirits and peoples of that, historically and presently, I want to do a book called The Three Faces of Eve, which represent the divine feminine from her, I can't say existence because she's always been, but from our awareness, first awareness of her as a form of material aspect and spirit. So everything she's ever been known by and everything that she does, I've tried to condense into three kinds of person. And so that's what my last book will probably be, my magnum opus, I think.
Presenting the divine feminine as the warrior, the huntress, the mother, the sorceress,
Yes,
the divine redemptrix. That's definitely going to be yet another magnum opus. I'm curious to see that unfold. With all the research that you've done, with all of the work, the titles, what has been the contributing factor to any challenges that you faced within the scope of your work, within the scope of your research?
The difficulty in finding original material that has not been heavily biased in its construction. That has been the greatest challenge, I think, finding material that I can actually use. Beyond that, it's time. Time is a huge impediment. But also worrying. I found myself initially worrying about, prejudice from people. Would they understand what I'm trying to say? Would they be hostile towards it because it's different? Or would they be more open-minded and say, well, I don't agree with that, but that's fine. Or, which I hope people can do, to agree to disagree. But I have made my case quite strongly, I think. I've backed it up with lots of information. I did have the choice of making a much smaller book and saying, I believe this, this, and this is my view. And the book would have been a few pages. But I thought, no, to be fair to people, if I'm saying something that challenges contention and belief and current popular opinion, I've got to be able to give them my reasons. I have to show them, chapter and verse. So that's what I've done. So that has been a challenge in itself as well, being able to find coherent material to put together for others, be able to digest for themselves and make up their own views.
Certain countries seem to have the lion's share. One of the biggest challenges for me is finding academic texts, finding translations in English. The majority of the texts in Assyriology are in German. There are no English translations. The Germans have the lion's share, and I unfortunately spent 4 years of high school studying French when clearly I should have learned to speak German. Has that been the case for you? Are a lot of the research materials in other languages that are difficult to access in English?
Absolutely. That is an absolute problem. A lot of the Danish works and German works, yeah, it's really hard. So I've managed to find a couple of people that have been able to translate small bits for me, the most crucial pieces. But beyond that, it's been trying to chase down English translations, which are not necessarily always the best. So again, it's going back to language and painstakingly going through online dictionaries and trying to work things out what is actually being said. So yes, it can take many, many, many hours just to get a sentence to actually make sense, because you then have to look around what is being said to try and get the truth of it, as well as translation of it, because the context is, I bang on a lot about context. because it is important. It's not enough to just translate something and expect it to mean something, because the interpretation of the translation is often very different. You can ask several people to translate one piece of something from the sagas, for instance. Oh, that's another book that's coming out in that series, by the way, where I look at the authors of the Eddas and sagas. I challenge the concept that it's Snorri. So I'm sure that will raise a few eyebrows.
They can sound off in the comments when the book's available.
That's another one. Because yes, you can. I give examples in the book here that you have there, the Search for Ódinn, that you got one translation of the runes, for instance, and then you'll get someone else that transliterates it differently, but all their interpretations of the same translation are different. A sentence can be taken completely out of that and made to say something it doesn't, because you've not studied what is actually being said around it, or the situation, or even who said it. Because again, historians writing, in 700 AD had their own bias.
Yes.
They had a purpose for what they were saying and who they were writing to as well.
Here we are on an auspicious day recording this interview on a Wednesday. And yes. I'm curious because I have to ask these questions because I want to know everyone's business. And if you choose not to answer this question, I totally understand. Given the scope of work that you've done with Ódinn and your tradition and your role within in your clan, mm-hmm. How does Ódinn come into play in your own spiritual praxis? And I ask this to complement a follow-up question. The images in your books with these, I guess you could call them cultic images, these cultic idols, if you will, they are so fascinating to me. I am always in awe whenever I see a cultic image or an idol or an icon. And I have to ask, does your garden contain at least one effigy devoted to this complex divine figure?
Yes, it does. And so does my home and my hearth. The thing is, all of these things have, as people will discover when they read the books, especially all three of them together, I'm hoping to have built up a pattern that they can recognize and follow as leading them somewhere towards my own conclusion. It's the ancestry that's so important, the ancestry that speaks to a deep need within all of us to know who we are and where we belong. So without those roots, we are nothing, we are no one, and we're in free fall. So we need to cling to the notion of our roots. We need to have that recognition of belonging. And to me, that's what Ódinn represents, a final figure for a specific trajectory of ancestry and a particular belief. So therefore, in my home and my garden, yes, I have images and lovely little icons and effigies of these figures because they are important. We've got hogers in the garden, the stacked rocks, as places that we have reverence for, and remembrance as cairns for our ancestors, for our relationship with our past. Because that's all that culture can nourish us with and nurture us forward by recognizing the importance of these things. The notion of that is one that's very much important in that it allows me an ability to be stronger, more cunning, more warrior-like, because I used to be quite introverted. It's made me much more extroverted. It's definitely made me a stronger person. And it's allowed me to speak my truth with more conviction instead of almost apologetically. I'm now saying, no, I actually believe this. You don't have to, but I do. So yes, it's made me a bit more forthright, I think. And I think as far as the clan goes, the figure of Ódinn and Woden specifically more so, it's about the links to our roots, to the root and heart of our culture, to the spirit of mysticism, to the spirit of ecstasy, specifically to be out of yourself, to seek the knowledge, the wisdom of ages, to not be fearful of grasping it, to not be fearful of treading where angels fear to tread, to not be afraid, to never look back, but to seize everything, to seize the day, to seize the moment, and to seize the notion, and think, laugh in the face of death was the famous, Viking maxim. Embrace the day, take what fate has brought, work with it, and overcome it, but do so with a smile on your face. So it's being positive and upbeat, because all of those traditions, all of those elements from the heathen tradition are about being upbeat, being strong in your conviction, and not being down at heart, always looking up, always looking forward.
We've talked about so many different things, and I'm sure that I'll have many more questions to throw your way, but I have your contact information, so I can just bug you there. But if others want to follow up with you and ask you questions, or keep up to date with your recent projects or your day to day, do you have a social media presence that they can refer to, or are you largely unplugged the way I wish I could be?
I would like to be, but yeah, I have been very bad actually the past 6 months, because we've just moved up to Scotland. So I've been very much entrenched in getting settled in this new place, getting familiar with the Landvetter here and the whole ambience of this new world up here. It's just absolutely immersed me. So for 6 months I've been off the planet, literally. But yes, I do have a Facebook. I have for the clan and also for myself. So it's under the Clan of Tubal Cain, and there's also another one for myself. And from now on, I do promise to be more active on both accounts.
Well, I will certainly put links for both accounts in the About section of this video, as well as a list, of course, of your works. Again, we have covered so many topics, and I am just in awe of your work. I cannot express how phenomenal it is to speak with you today and to share this time with you. And I certainly look forward to devouring the Devil's Supper and committing passages to memory, because again, that's definitely an area of interest that will be occupying a great deal of my time for perhaps the foreseeable future. So again, Shani, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining me on this auspicious day dedicated to the complex and daunting god that is Ódinn, that is Woden.
Okay, thank you very much as well, Samuel. Take care.
If you're a new viewer and would like to stay up to date with the latest from Bibliosophia, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for our channel.